Welcome. So if you are watching this video for the first time, welcome, 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 and thanks for taking the time. We're about to go into an introduction, so let me tell you a little bit about what happened, because you may be wondering why I am showing up at the beginning of your video like this. So when we did the training today for S Factor, I made an error and forgot to start the recording on time. So this is an edited intro of what you missed from the very beginning, because I wanted to make sure that you got every opportunity to be part of the full presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to jump into the first section, and then you're going to dive right into the rest of the presentation where you will see the rest of your teammates and colleagues. So hold on one second, and we're going to dive right in. Okay, so welcome to You, Me, Us, and We, a conversation on equality, diversity, and inclusivity. We're talking about three specific areas because when we start to have the conversation around diversity, what we find is there are other areas that overlap. It's not just one specific issue. One specific issue is usually the start of a conversation, not the wrap up. So I always like to start every training or meeting with setting expectations and making agreements up front instead of assumptions so that we're all clear from the beginning. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to discuss three key areas: equality, inclusivity, and diversity. We will experience some exercises, games, conversation, and also we wanted to make sure that we had some fun in the process. I'm a big believer in starting on time and ending on time, so we're going to try to do that. You're in a recorded video, so it may go a little bit over because of my my re-intro. And then the one thing I do recommend is that you eliminate distractions. If you can, this I mentioned earlier that this is typically a much longer training that we condensed into 2 hours specifically for you to be sensitive to your schedules. So if you can eliminate outside distractions so you can be focused, you're going to get a much, much better experience, and I want you to have the best experience possible. The other thing that I ask is that we all have mutual respect and confidentiality. We are talking about some very meaningful conversations or topics, and also the experiences that go with that. So out of respect for your colleagues, your peers, your coworkers, management, myself, Rosalind, who you'll meet in a few minutes, however you need to look at it in your mind, I just ask that we all respect confidentiality and respect for one another. And then the last thing is I encourage everyone to share and ask questions in a place where it was really important that people be able to do that without any fear or judgment. I think we did a great job of that in the training, where there were some really good conversations that came up that has given us some extra things to follow up on, which I think are certainly worth exploring. And I'm excited for you to hear how those conversations unfold as well. So why now? The truth is diversity trainings and initiatives have been around for years and years and years, but relevance in the mainstream media and in our day-to-day living has increased the importance and the value around not just the conversation, but staying well informed. What you will find is there may be terms in here that may sound familiar to you, but there may also be terms in here or statistics that don't sound familiar to you. And so staying informed and taking accountability or responsibility for us all to educate ourselves helps us all stay on top of what's going on, but it also allows for an even more diverse and meaningful conversation, which is why we're here today. So equality, this is where I'm going to wrap up, and then we're going to turn over into the recording. So equality is the state of being equal, which is not just equally or especially in status, rights, and opportunities. So you may think of equality as, oh, I know what equality is. Equality is equal pay for women as men, which is true. You may think of equality as, oh, it's about recognizing or including a specific race or culture, which is also true. But it's also more than that. And we're going to get into the classifications that are covered in equality as we turn over into the full presentation. So this is where I leave you, and then everything's going to transfer over and you'll continue the conversation from there. when it comes to equality, we're looking in the UK, they do a much better job than we do because they've had this around for a long time and they integrate it into the businesses where it's also part of their legal system. Here, we've done a fair job, but we can still do better. So let's look at what some of those areas are that are covered when it comes to equality. So you have things like age. And when I talk about age, I don't always mean or necessarily mean somebody who is older and there's age discrimination. I'm sure there have been people, maybe even some here who are participating in the training or watching the recording that that you may have been told, oh, you don't know because you're too young to understand. And then on the flip side, we have people who get all this wisdom and we work really hard to have these careers and have all these things to offer. But when we hit a certain age, we may start to feel irrelevant because we don't fit into a certain demographic. So age is a part of that. Disability, that could be physical, it can be mental. So we're not just looking at one specific category. Sex, sexual orientation, marriage and civil partnership is another one. Pregnancy and maternity is another one. Religion or belief, race, gender reassignment, and class and weight are not protected, but let's look at it because we do see where there is an inequity and sometimes discrimination when it comes to class and weight. So we want to take all of these things into consideration. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rosalind.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. Hello again, everyone. And I'm going to talk about discrimination for just a few seconds here. First of all, the first bullet, direct discrimination versus indirect discrimination. I'll touch on direct discrimination first. That's when an individual is treated differently or worse because of who they are. It could be because of disability, because of age, for example. Indirect discrimination is generally a result of practices or policies that could be generated by an organization, and it could cause disadvantages for a group or group of people. Next bullet, associative discrimination. That is when discrimination is associated with a class, for instance, race, religion, and the list goes on, but it's because of a class. And then my favorite one to discuss is perception discrimination. This is discrimination that's based on the perception that an individual is part of a group. So I'll give you an example. You're treating someone differently or worse than others because you perceive or you think that they are part of a group. For example, you could say, she looks like she is blank and I don't like blank, so therefore I'm going to treat her differently. So that's a good example of perception discrimination. Next slide, please. Okay. We're going to jump into examples of inequality. So on the first bullet, disparaging remarks, that is racial slurs, offensive terms, and statements related to any of the areas we mentioned earlier. I'll use the N-word. The N-word obviously is a racial slur that's a disparaging remark and offensive. Political, that's offensive terms and statements related to a person's party, affiliation, etc. For instance, if someone may say, I wouldn't vote for her, she's part of the blank party, and they're all a bunch of nuts. That's an example of political inequality. Family matters, dating outside of your race or your faith or etc. An example of that obviously is if you're in a family that are based of, they're devout Catholics, and one member of the family decides to go outside the faith and date or marry, in some cases, someone that's a Baptist. So that's an example of that. Marital rights, that's not allowing a same-sex couple, for instance, to marry, have access to health care, etc., like a couple that's made of a couple of individuals from opposite sex. Next slide, please. Okay, right to adopt, raise children, that is, you used to see this in the old days. I say old days because I'm probably older than a lot of people that are on this on this call right now. But in the old days, older people weren't allowed to adopt. You don't see that so much nowadays, but you do see, examples of inequality for same-sex couples. You see that more than you do age now for but adopting children. In the old days, you can also find examples of if you were a single woman or single man, that you were not allowed to adopt. And we have evolved somewhat as far as that's concerned. Issues on the job, that is refusing to promote someone of a different gender or age group based on who has historically filled that same position. And a lot of people, when they see this particular bullet, they think of someone old not being able to have a promotion because of their age. Well, it can be the opposite. It could be where, historically speaking, someone older or seasoned, is like I like to say, held the position at one point, and a younger person wants to fill the position and is not given the opportunity because of their age. So you can see it happen in both ways. Next bullet, misunderstood. That is employees taking issue with a transgender person, for instance, sharing the same restroom. Next one is target of religious groups. Rallies hosted by a group in protest of a particular faith. I'll give you an example. Here in the Atlanta area, there was a mosque that has been in existence for a while, and they decided they had an increase of people that were attending, and they wanted to increase their space. Well, there was a rally hosted by members of the community that were in an uproar. Some claim that was because of parking and so on and congestion, but others just came out and said, we just don't want any more people coming to that mosque. We don't want the mosque here. So that's an example. And the last example is something that we've seen a lot in the in news and newspaper, on the news stations, about victims of violence. For instance, people of color being targeted. They're being, they've been injured, and in some cases they have been killed because of the color of their skin. Next, please. Okay, let's discuss some reasons people tend to discriminate, and it can be intentional or not intentional. Upbringing. This could be based on your parents or your grandparents, how you were raised, or an aunt and uncle. And it can also be based on how your parents or the person that has raised you was, what their upbringing was like. Culture, that could be a variety of things. It could be the culture within your household, the culture within your city, your community, and so on. Religion, we touched on that a little bit in a previous slide. We all may belong to the same faith, but our teachings may be different within our faith. And the clergyman, the priest, the pastor, the so on, may teach from the same book, the Bible, what have you, but teach in a different way. So we all are taught in different ways. So that helps us either discriminate or not discriminate against people, intentionally or not intentionally. Bias or stereotype, we're going to touch on this a couple times this evening. We all have a bias or two or three or four, and also stereotypes. People tend to put people in a box, and as a result, discriminate against them or not discriminate against them. Political views, our political views can shape the way we feel about each other, how we treat each other, whether or not we discriminate against each other. Social status, most people think when they hear social status, they think about someone being discriminated against because they are poor. Well, you can also have it where it's on the flip side, where people discriminate against people because they have more money or they are perceived to be rich or better off than others. Okay, next bullet, where they live. It could be based on, again, the region, your neighborhood, your state, your country. It could be if you're in a large apartment building, it could be a certain floor. So it could be all of that makes us either discriminate or not discriminate, intentionally or not intentionally. Media. We all know that we are in a 24-hour news cycle at this point. There's not a time of the day where you can't go on the internet and find some type of news. But I always tell people you always have access to news, whether it's in print, whether it's on your TV, what have you. But it's our duty to research for ourselves and listen to all sides and form our own opinions. Fear is the root of most. Can you see it? We're out.
Sorry about that. I was trying to go to the.
That's okay. I can talk, and I can talk when we get to that. Fear, I always say, the root of most phobias and the root of all evil. I always say that you may fear what you don't understand or research. So it's a good idea to research some things, and then you would be less apt to fear it, and hopefully less apt to discriminate.
So
okay.
Let's do a quick check-in before we go to the next section. Does anybody have any questions?
And I'm talking fast, by the way, because I'm conscious of the time, so I'm not always talking like an auctioneer, but
Anyone have questions or comments? I would just want to make sure that we make space for it. If not, we'll continue.
and I noticed someone asked about the slides.
Yeah, I already responded. Thanks.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay, we're on it.
Back to it.
Okay, next slide. Say this, not that. So it's always a good thing to think before you ask. Sometimes a question may seem innocent, but can be highly offensive to the person being asked. And I like to interject a couple of personal examples. I've had this happen with my children and also my daughter-in-law, members of my family members. They'll ask me or ask them, "What are you?" Meaning, you know, are you African American? What are you? You know, and it's not a nice thing to say. Obviously, it takes me back when people say that, and I'll say, well, they're a person. That's what they are. So always think before you ask, because you may offend someone. Don't make assumptions. Don't assume something. Get your facts first before you actually make a comment and say the wrong thing. Because once something is out of your mouth, you can't take it back. It's like putting toothpaste back in a tube. Can't do it. Okay, be mindful of terminology. Terms change. Stay current on relevant discussions, terms, and meanings. And they're ever changing. I will never say that I'm an absolute guru in this topic. I'm actually learning something every day. I learn something every time we do a training. I learn something from the participants that are on the call. And in 1 or 2 slides after this, you're going to see an example of how quick terminology can change. And even Gina and I have to play catch up sometimes. Here's one of my favorite ones: is not a fad or lifestyle. I've had several family members say, when we have a family member that, you know, comes to us and says, "Hey, I'm gay," or "I'm this, I'm that," and a family member will quickly say, "Oh, it's just a fad. They'll grow out of it." And my comment is, well, leg warmers were a fad, but you can't say that someone's sexual orientation is a fad. You can't say it's a lifestyle. Living on the beach lifestyle, but you can't say that someone's sexual orientation is a fad or lifestyle. Okay, next bullet: listen to what's being said. Use reflective listening, like as for instance, let me make sure I understand. So if you're not sure, or if you need a buffer, you can say, let me make sure I understand. And the more times than not, someone will rephrase what they're saying or rephrase the question so that you can understand what you're hearing and answer accordingly.
And I'm just in there.
Go ahead.
Even if you think you do understand, it's still okay to say, let me make sure I understand, or is it okay if I repeat back to you what I heard to make sure that I'm clear? That's okay.
Right. I think people appreciate that when you do that as well. Last bullet point on this slide: don't ask extremely personal questions, period. It's just not a good thing to do. You wouldn't like it if a complete stranger came to you and asked you something really personal. It's just not something that you do. So always think about the question or the comment you're going to make. How personal is it? How well do you know this person? And do you know this person well enough to ask this question? Next slide, please.
It always reminds me of the question, when is it appropriate to ask a woman if she's pregnant?
Never.
Never. So
never. And I'll chime in on that. I always say this. My first pregnancy, I had just delivered, and the baby was a week old, and I had gone to, it was Thrifty at the time, but it's now Rite Aid. And I was wearing my size 2 pants, thinking I'm all that. And someone asked me, "Oh, what do you do?" Well, I had the baby a week ago. I was highly offended.
Oh, when did you do? Okay.
Okay. Gender neutral terms. And I have to say, I am guilty of this. I will throw shade my way. The very first bullet in particular, I have to constantly remind myself to say service technician in lieu of repairman. So I'm a work in progress. And, you know, skills are changing, trades are changing, and you just don't have men coming to repair things all the time. You have, you know, a variety of people coming to your home to, you know, fix your DirecTV, which mine is always broken, it seems, and so on. Flight attendant versus stewardess. I don't think too many people say stewardess anymore unless you're older, generally speaking. Most people say flight attendant. That is the chosen word. Individuals or persons. Use of they in lieu of he or she. That's something that a lot of people need to hone in on. Okay, here's something for you. You may think this is a typo. Folks, F-O-L-X. Well, you see folks, friends, guests in lieu of ladies and gentlemen. Well, Gina and I just learned something very recently. We thought that the term folks, F-O-L-K-S, was still okay to say. And we are now told that F-O-L-X is the word to say. And quite honestly, I don't understand what's wrong with K-S on the end, but that is what people are using now. So this is an example of how things can change rapidly. This just changed for me just a couple of days ago.
And I want to be careful that we don't say that it replaces it. I believe it's still
Right.
addition. You can still,
Right.
if you're seeing it, the reason we're bringing these up is if you're seeing them so that you're familiar with the terms.
Right.
If you're
Because
not,
one can think when they see it, oh, that's a typo or that's slang, but it's just another way of saying it. Okay, sexual orientation versus sexual preference. And then my favorite, Latino, no, Latinx, yes. And the reason for that is because in Spanish, obviously, an O refers to the male gender and A, female gender. Okay. On the flip side, what are some of your biases? And we all have them. I'm not asking you to actually call them out right now, but you might want to think about them in your head. And while you're thinking about that, I'd like for you to think about what shaped those biases. Was it your upbringing? And I'll share a couple things with you briefly. I have biases just like everyone else. I'm a work in progress, so I try to work on them all the time. In fact, every time I do anything pertaining to diversity, it makes me see a little bit more of myself to see that I am a work in progress. And the reason why I believe I have some of the biases I've had over the years is my upbringing. My parents were from the South and grew up very poor. So I have some biases based on how they were brought up. And then on the flip side, I spent most of my time, childhood in Southern California in an upper middle class neighborhood. So I have my own experience that has shaped who I am and what my biases are. Again, it could be where you live or where you grew up, your religious beliefs, past positive or negative experience. A past negative experience can shape you the wrong way, and it's just something that we all have to fight to overcome. And having biases doesn't make you a horrible person. It just makes you human. Is what you do with those biases that is important. And again, we're all a work in progress, and we all have them.
okay, so I'm going to take you guys off of screen share in just a moment. So that covers equality. We're going to move into the second section, but before we do, I just want to ask, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now. Does anybody have questions or comments or anything you want to share from the first section? It's okay if you don't. Okay, so here's what we're going to do now. We're going to talk about inclusivity, and inclusivity is an intention or policy of including people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as people who are handicapped or learning disabled or racial and even sexual minorities. So what we're going to do is we're going to play a game. So you're going to want either a pen and paper. I'm going to take you guys all off of mute too, because it's always fun to get feedback as you're going through the process. So you either want a pen and paper, or if you can count on your phone, that's okay too, like a calculator or whatever. And we are going to play Keep the Micro from Going Macro. So let me...
Before we start, is there an answer to that question that's on the screen?
I can't hear you.
Let me see. Is there a good source in order to stay up to date? We're going to, at the end of the presentation, or the end of the training, you will have, when you get your copy, there will be 2 pages of sources for you with links so that you can stay up on diversity, equality, inclusivity as it relates to lots of different categories and not just specifically one area. And that will also help you stay the most current on terms as well. Okay, why am I trying to unmute? So some of you are still muted, so I'm just going to get you muted. Okay, let me pull this up. All right, so micro inequities, as I was saying earlier, are they're acts that can demean or marginalize a person. Microaggressions are acts that either stereotype or unfairly criticize or disparage a person. So in other words, it's when the small things get really, really big. And this is what you want to keep from happening. So we're going to play a game called Keep the Micro from Going Macro. And I'm just trying to pull up my notes here. Okay, so here's how it works. I am going to write a statement, and you are going to give yourself a point for each statement that is true. So if you have ever put your phone on a table while having a meal with another person, I want you to give yourself a point.
A turned on phone or turned off?
Right? Well, if it's on, well, here's the thing. If it's on the table, you have some kind of intention, and it's not to just keep an eye on it, right? You're
Well,
probably,
I don't carry a handbag, so I have to put my phone on. I turn it off, but put it on the table.
okay, then you wouldn't give yourself a point. If it's on, or if you're using it with the intention of waiting for a phone call or a text or whatever that is, then you
Got
get a point.
Got it.
Okay, next one. If you have ever checked emails during a meeting, give yourself a point. Okay, I'm already watching faces like this. Here's the thing. This game makes me feel terrible about myself.
Me too. I usually end up with the most points, by the way.
If you've ever looked at the time during a face-to-face conversation, give yourself a point.
If you ever looked at the what during
The
it?
time.
If you've ever been having a face-to-face conversation with someone and you happen to look at the time during that conversation,
Time.
give yourself a point. If you have written or responded to a text or email during a meeting, give yourself a point.
I feel like we had to cut these points in half if you're a parent.
If you have ever answered a call when someone was mid-sentence, give yourself a point. I did this one in a meeting recently, and somebody was horrified because she said she does it all the time and didn't realize it. If you've ever shushed someone mid-sentence, give yourself a point.
All the time.
Wait, shush somebody that you're talking to, or shush somebody who's like being loud in a theater?
Well, that's different. What's your intention?
Okay.
What if you're being interrupted by a toddler?
Yeah.
So it depends how you handle micro inequities in your home business.
He's clearly in charge, so
If you've ever put your hand up while someone was talking to you and not because you were asking a question, give yourself a point.
People actually do that.
If you've ever multitasked,
Clip.
clip. If you've ever multitasked while someone was having a conversation with you, give yourself a point. I have to tell you, my best friend said to me the other night, he goes, what if I'm cleaning while I'm having a conversation? And I said, if it's at my house, you don't have to give yourself a point. It's encouraged, it's productive. Now, if you have ever rolled your eyes during a meeting or conversation, give yourself a point. If you've ever raised your voice and not because somebody couldn't hear you, give yourself a point. Isn't this fun?
In a conversation or a meeting?
Doesn't matter. If you've ever cut a meeting short because you were too busy, give yourself a point. Or if you've ever showed up late for an appointment or a meeting because of your schedule, not because there was unexpected traffic, but maybe because you didn't leave, so you didn't expect the traffic, give yourself a point. If you've ever consistently mispronounced someone's name, give yourself a point. If you've ever given someone you prefer extra attention over another during a conversation, give yourself a point. Aren't you glad we don't have to announce these out loud? If you've ever sighed loudly or in a meeting or conversation, which time, give yourself a point. If you're me, give yourself 25 points.
I'm worse than you.
If you've ever read half of a person's email and then asked them to explain the rest, give yourself a point. If you've ever confused someone from one ethnicity for someone else of the same ethnicity, give yourself a point. If someone has ever said to you, or you've said this, "You don't sound black," give yourself a point.
Someone said
Whoa.
it to you, or you've said it to someone.
If someone has said it to you, or if you've said it to someone, give yourself a point. If you've ever had this said to you or by you to a person of color, "You are so articulate," give yourself a point.
Can I ask why you would give yourself a point if somebody says that to you? Like if you are receiving an aggression, why you'd get a point?
So that you can be aware of how you're impacted. We're not going to take these points and then say, okay, this means this about you. It's so that you can be aware of either how you participate or how you're impacted.
Okay.
Or experienced.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you've ever had someone say to you or by you, "How young are you?" give yourself a point. Or if someone has said to you or by you, "I never would have guessed you were gay," give yourself a point. And then the last one is, if anyone has ever said to you, or if you've ever said to another person, "You're still sharp for your age," give yourself a point. Okay, so I'm just watching along. Okay. So how did everybody do? You don't have to tell me how many. Was anybody surprised at the number of points they got?
I'll be honest and say I have 9. I'm sorry, I have 14. 14.
I think her number went up since the last training.
No, I actually dropped one.
Anybody surprised by the number? No? Yes?
I
No?
mean, we don't really know what the number means.
Well, the number, here's what it means. If you're participating and you were answering yes to, "I have done a lot of these things," or some of these things, it shows you these are microaggressions and
Well, what is
inequity.
a lot? Like if there was 50 questions and you answered 25 of them, then that's 50%. If it's 10, you know what I mean? How do you determine what's a lot?
Well, you can definitely do percentages to look at it, but if you're going to do percentages, then you want to take out the ones where you were impacted, not the ones where you took action, because that's going to make a difference in whether or not you initiate or you've been impacted.
In all fairness to me, all 14 wasn't something I did. Some of it was I experienced myself.
So were there any, let me ask you a question. Was there anything that I brought up or mentioned that surprised you that you may not have recognized or thought was a microinequity or microaggression? Because I know the first time I did it, there were lots of things on there that I didn't realize the impact, and it has since changed how I show up.
Some of the first
I'd say there are quite a
that you mentioned about the phone on the table or sending an email during a meeting. It's the first few questions were a little bit surprising to me.
Okay. Okay. So it's just it's the point is not, let me be really clear about what the point is and what the point isn't. The point is not to shame anybody. The point is not to show anybody, "Oh my God, I had 18 points out of 22. I must be a terrible person." It's to show us how we're showing up and how our behavior may impact another person without us even realizing it. I don't think there's anybody on here who gave themselves a point for anything who was probably calculating in the back of their head, unless you are, how can I make this person feel less than? Sometimes we do things out of habit or because of what we see and we think is acceptable, and so we do it because we think that's just what we do. But when we learn how it can impact someone, that's how it changes our thought process, whether or not we choose to behave that way again, or maybe we make a different choice. Make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I would say that a lot of the first few are things that I personally, this is Jess, by the way, been becoming more aware of and something that I've been working on, but I'm definitely still Definitely still do them sometimes. And so it's good to have the awareness. And I love that you're bringing awareness to a lot of those.
Great, great. Anyone else have anything else they want to add? If not, we'll keep going. Okay, let me bring the screen back up. I don't know where the screen just went. Everybody bear with me. Hold on, there's something. Hold on, you guys. It's not letting me share the screen again. Okay, here we go. Okay, everyone can see okay? Okay. So, uh-oh, hold on. Okay, Rosalind, back to
All
you.
right. Okay, back to me. So implicit bias, what is it? Do I have it? I always say, can I catch it? Is there a pill for it? And if so, how do I get rid of it? So the good news is everybody has them. There isn't a pill for it yet, but there's a pill for everything, it seems. And again, we all have it. So let's go to the next slide and discuss it. Okay, another word for implicit bias is also implicit stereotypes. And what it is associating particular traits or attributes to a certain social group, usually based on gender orientation or race. So I'll give you an example. It is said by some that all African Americans are good at sports or good at dancing. I think I'm an excellent dancer, but I am lousy at sports. I hate sports. I know hardly anything about them, and I'm not very athletic. So that's an example. It's believed to be an unconscious behavior. It's influenced by our life experiences and may affect our decision-making and actions. And again, all of us have biases. Some we aren't aware of, and some we recognize. And if you learn nothing else tonight, I think if you recognize something that you can do better at, then I think we need to make a conscious effort to try to become better. We're never going to be perfect, but we can always be better. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide is diversity and inclusion. So diversity and inclusion have different meanings, but they overlap in some instances. So let's take diversity or diverse first on the left-hand side. So a couple bullet points. It's variety or different, unlike, meaning unlike others, dissimilar, distinct, separate from the rest, included in groups because of differences. On the other side, inclusion or inclusivity is being included in a group, integrated, being a part of what everyone else is. And what I always like to say is you have a seat at the table and you're also able to speak at the table. You have a say-so in the process. Next bullet point, groups that consist of many of the same types and one or two of a different type. And then the last bullet, groups that are, I don't know if anyone can see the very bottom, Gina. Can everyone see the very bottom? I'll read it anyway. Groups that are all types, shapes, and sizes. So that was the last bullet point. And so you can see how they overlap in some cases, and then they can have different meanings depending on how you use it. Okay, next slide. Diversity, I'm not going to read the entire, excuse me, definition to you. In a nutshell, it's a degree of differences in identifying features among the members of a purposefully defined group. It could be gender, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the list will go on and on the longer that we're on the earth probably. But it's basically, this definition addresses all the differences. And you may find that you as a person may fit into very different, well, a bunch of different groups, not just one, because we're all a mix of different things. So, next slide. White privilege. This is a hot button topic sometimes, but what I want to start out by saying is this is not a term that's meant as an insult or to demean anyone by any stretch of imagination. And I personally, when I refer to white privilege, it is not to talk about people that are a different color than me or demean anyone. I'll go into it a little bit further, but again, it's not meant as an insult. So please do not take it as an insult. So first bullet, white privilege is viewed as an unearned advantage over non-whites, and it can also be a societal benefit. And then I'm going to go into a couple stats here for you. And this is according to the Bureau of Labor. And this particular slide was achieved by, I looked at a report on April 13th, 2018, or it's actually dated that date. It was based on the first quarter of 2018, so it's relevant today. And according to the Bureau of Labor, whites earn more than non-whites. The second bullet, and I'm quoting this, the median weekly income for a full-time Latinx male was $675 per week, blacks $696 per week, and $911 per week for whites for the first quarter in 2018. So there is a disparity.
And
Next
I
slide.
want to add something before we go to the next slide, because I think it's important to note this. A lot of times what I hear in the marketplace is how white privilege is misunderstood from the perspective of implying that people who are white do not have struggles. That is not what white privilege is.
Absolutely not.
So let's just be really clear about that up front. It is not to imply that it's been an easy life. It's to be very clear that it's viewed as an unearned advantage over people who are not white. And these are the statistics, just to raise some awareness.
And to piggyback on that, that's not to mean that people of color are struggling every day of their life either. There are, we all have our own set of struggles, and we all have our own victories. Okay, next slide. It is a term that implies those with white skin are elevated to a higher status than non-whites and thus fare better than non-whites. And I'm going to give you an example. The now defunct Countrywide Loans and most recently Wells Fargo were the subject of class action lawsuits for redlining based on race. Blacks and Latinx customers were charged higher interest rates in some cases, and you're looking at one. I was part of that class action lawsuit. And I'll give you a real brief scenario of what happened. My husband and I purchased a house in 2003 in an upper middle class neighborhood. It was our dream home, close to the water and the whole 9 yards. And we had, I think a great FICO score, and paid our bills on time and all that, and had money to put down on the house, a large amount, and did so. Well, years later, we found out that we were part of a class action lawsuit. We were charged a higher interest rate because either he did or I did or both checked the box that said African American or Black, and we were charged a higher interest rate as a result. So I was, of course, highly offended when I found it out. Next slide. So what if you don't see color? And I have to say, I hear this a lot, not as much as I used to, but I hear from people, well-intending people, I don't see color, I wasn't raised to see color. And when I used to hear this, I never knew quite what to say. In my mind, I was thinking, well, geez, of course you see color, because unless you're sight impaired, you see. The first thing you see about me is that I'm a petite African-American woman. I'm, not a tall blonde. That's the first thing you see. You see me, and that's okay to see me. It's okay to see another person's individual color or hue. Acknowledgement does not necessarily mean that you see them as a lesser being. It's considered a problem if you use color to define their character or ability, though. So it's okay to see me, see all of me, and appreciate me, just as though I should see you and appreciate all of you. So what I say to people, I appreciate you saying that, but I rather you have said, you know what, I was raised, or I am of the mindset that I appreciate everyone, no matter what the color of their skin or their hue.
And let's just add one more thing before we go into the next section, is that there was a time, and I'm going to stop the sharing for a second. If you remember, there was a time when it was appropriate to say, I don't see color. I often refer to when Michael Jackson came out with the song, it doesn't matter if you're black and white, or black or white, because that's when a lot of people started saying that. So it was kind of like the cool thing to say, but it wasn't really a cool thing to say. So that's why, so the reason I'm saying this is because that's why it's important to understand the terminology and how it changes, because sometimes you may feel like you're using an appropriate term that was once appropriate, but is no longer appropriate.
And again, the reason why people use it is because they want to let you know that they care about you, they love you, what have you, and they see you for the person that you are.
Okay, so let's do another exercise. So
This one I like a lot. I
Yeah,
hope you like it as
so
well.
we are going to ask some questions and just show of hands. So we're all in it together and we're all going to do it together. We're going to ask a series of questions and just see how your experience or what your experience has been. So show of hands, can you go anywhere and purchase a doll that looks like you? Okay, great. Can you oh, I'm sorry, Rosalind, go ahead.
Yeah, you're raining on my parade. Can you purchase a greeting card with images of individuals that are of the same race or culture virtually in any store that sells greeting cards?
Okay. Can you purchase makeup in your shade at the grocery store? How about hair care products? Okay.
Can you purposely avoid seeing people that are the same race or culture?
Oh, I can. I live in Orange County. I totally can.
Well, I will say in San Diego, I could, but now that I live in Atlanta, I can't.
Okay. Have you ever been stopped by a stranger that asks to touch your hair or inquire how you got your hair to look the way it does?
Every day.
Okay.
Can you shop in a high-end store without being followed?
Okay. As a teen, if you were with a large group of those of the same race or culture, would anyone give you a second look while you were in a store?
When you're shopping in a store and you find a small item, how do you hold the item before checking out at the register? And here's my item.
Here's how we hold ours, Rosalind and I. And here's why. Because sometimes what happens is when you're in a store and you're holding an item that's small, people will look at you differently. I have been followed in very high-end stores where what I was able to afford was not an issue. But because of the color of my skin, there was an implied bias. Rosalind, anything you want to add before you move on?
Yeah, I will also say it's not just in the US, by the way. For me, I travel a lot and I've had it happen to me in Europe. I've had it happen all over the place, but I grew up with the mindset is if you have something small, you better hold it out so people can see that you're not putting it in your handbag.
Now it's interesting because we've done this training with other people where other people have said, wow, it never landed on me that way. I never thought about it. I'll just throw it in the bag my recycling bag that I bring for my shopping anyway, or I'll just throw it on top of, the pocket on my handbag or whatever. So it's, again, this isn't a thing to show anybody like, see how you have it so much better than us. It's not that. It's just to show how we all have different experiences and we're all different, but there are also things that we can celebrate in our differences by better understanding what those experiences are. Okay. Next one, when you excel at something, do you think you are representing your race or culture? And do other races seem as though they are in awe because you were able to accomplish what you did?
I have an example of that. Years ago, I was doing a presentation in front of about 5,000 people. And the presentation consisted of me reading a teleprompter. I could ad-lib a little bit, but it's basically me reading a teleprompter. At the end, people were congratulating me. Oh, you did so well. I said, well, yeah, I was reading a teleprompter and I've been reading since I was in kindergarten, And most people didn't say it in a mean way and didn't mean to be mean, but that's, I kind of took offense to that. Okay, growing up, did your teachers or professors look like you?
All right. And the last one, do most of the medical professionals in your town look like you? Okay. Couple. All right.
Now I'm half and half because in San Diego, no one did, but out here, yes.
All right. So let's go back to some screen sharing. And bear with me. All right. Rosalind, back to you.
Okay. So now we're on prejudice versus racism. What is the difference and what are the similarities? I'm glad you asked. Next slide.
I don't know why there we go.
Okay. So we'll start with prejudice first. It's a preconceived opinion, unfavorable feeling without firsthand knowledge, can be a learned behavior. You're usually predisposed. It's not necessarily racial in nature. In fact, you may prefer a certain brand of shoe that doesn't make you a racist. I always refer to shoes because I love shoes, by the way. Biased is the next bullet point, and it can cause harm. On the flip side, racism, prejudice directed at individual or at an individual or a group that you may know nothing about. In other words, judging a book by its cover. Usually a learned behavior is belief that all members of race possess certain undesirable attributes or behavior. Hatred based on color or ethnicity. Environmental, belief that those of another race or ethnicity is inferior. And the last one can cause systemic harm.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. You're a mind reader.
No, I actually tried to make sure it was on the right slide and it clicked.
Okay. The pros and cons of silence. And what we mean by the pros and cons of silence is if something comes up that may be controversial or someone that is perhaps expecting you to speak, this slide is speaks to the pros and cons of not saying anything. So let's start with the pros. Sometimes silence can be perceived as a good thing. So in other words, sometimes you just need to stop and listen. Sometimes you don't need to respond to something. Sometimes it's better not to respond to something. The pro of not responding is you see it as being drama-free. You don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing. You think that you're avoiding ridicule. No action means no reaction. It feels safe. It can be easier to learn by observing, which is sometimes true. And ignorance is bliss. The cons. Sometimes silence may be viewed negatively, or as I can say, or I like to say, silence is not always golden. So it can be seen as a sign of complacency, fear, lack of interest, lack of concern, smugness, and or inability. You may say the wrong thing. You may be ridiculed or shamed. Speaking our truth makes us vulnerable and uncomfortable, and it may cause additional harm. Gina, do you want to chime in at all on that?
I think we're going to get into some more stuff about this, but here's
Okay.
one of the things that I always use as a rule of thumb, and this is the best advice that I can give any and all of you. When it comes to speaking up, one of the most important things to do is not to respond emotionally. And it's one of the first things we do. It's often the first thing we do. And the reason why it's so important not to have that emotional response is because you can feel everything. You're entitled to feel everything. I want you to feel everything. We're human beings and we have emotions. But when we respond from an immediate emotional reaction, what happens is we get a response that meets that emotional reaction. And now we're fighting over feelings instead of over getting some resolution. And it takes away from the conversation, and that's when things can't get done. We can't resolve things. So I cannot stress the importance enough that when something happens, take a moment and really stop and ask yourself, what is it that you want to accomplish in the way that you're going to respond? So that you're really clear about why you're responding the way you are. If your feeling is, I want this person to really understand how their words impacted me or how offensive it is to a specific group, versus I am furious and I am outraged and I am offended and I want them to feel even an ounce of my pain. That is not going to get you what you want. It might make you feel good for about 5 minutes, but then you're probably going to go back to feeling bad again. So really think about what your intention is.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so what do? Speak up with confidence. Again, take a moment before you speak up. Pay attention to what's being said before you speak and respond. I always say, perhaps count for 10 seconds before you respond, because of course, words are like toothpaste. You can't put it back in the tube. Respond with facts to support your statements. There's nothing worse than someone spilling out something and you'll ask them, well, how do you know that? Well, I was told that, or I heard. And it can be sometimes something that you say that's very hurtful and you have no facts to substantiate what you're saying. Examine more than one approach or desired outcome. I do that a lot. I don't take everything as gospel. I actually try to do my research as much as possible. Be clear on your intention. If your intention is to hurt someone, then you might want to think of another intention, but think about what you want to get out of what you're saying or what you do. Say it in a way that you want someone to communicate the same information to you. And I always say that unless you don't like yourself. If you like yourself, you should want someone to communicate with you, to you, or with you the same way that you want to communicate with yourself. Don't take it personally, which is very hard to do, but take responsibility when appropriate. So, you know, learn from something. Be a little humble, and sometimes we have to eat a little humble pie. Make a conscious effort to review and edit anything in writing and eliminate emotion. You can't effectively solve an issue when you're fighting over feelings. And what I always do, there's many a day that I will start out an email, someone will say something and it will offend me, or they, you know, even intend it to offend me, and they want to get a rise out of me. So I'll just get on this rant, I'll be typing away and, you know, mean things. And then I look at it for a little bit, I read it, and I feel better now, and I hit delete and I start all over again. So that's one thing I have to constantly remind myself to do, because I'm a hot-tempered person. So I have to, you know, chill out, mellow, and then think, okay, that felt good. Now delete all that and write something that's meaningful. Okay, next slide. Okay, study when silent. Use it as an opportunity to learn. So I do a lot of listening usually. When I'm in a group of people, I do a lot of listening. I always say I try to receive more than transmit, because I think I can learn so much more by just listening to people and observing their body language and how they interact with me and other people. This is a hard one. Next bullet, observe without judgment. I always like to give a little personal spin on things. My oldest sister would kill me if she heard me say this, but my other sister and I refer to her as Judge Judy, because she means well, but she judges a lot. And so we have to constantly rein her in and say, hey, well, maybe they're doing this because of blah, blah, blah. You know, think of the other side. So it's really hard to do, but try to observe without judgment. Research what's being said. Is it accurate? We've talked about that before. In other words, mold your own thoughts. Examine more than one approach or desired outcome. It's a good way to think of things. Okay, if I think about it this way and approach it this way, what would the outcome be? By the same token, if I go this route, what would the outcome be? And be clear, again, be clear on your intention. And take what you've learned and use it in a positive way. When you know better, you do better. And I always say it's good to do a self-assessment every now and then, because we all need to critique ourselves, because none of us are perfect. Okay, next slide. Okay, I always feel like I need to do my radio announcer voice on this one, and now a word on colloquialism. First slide, or first bullet, all slang is not your slang. And I see this a lot, and I've been guilty of it myself. People will use slang to communicate with people because they think that they are somehow bridging the gap between themselves and the other person. They feel like it brings them closer, or that that person feels like they're more relatable. And that's not always the case. In some cultures, they take offense to you using their choice of slang. And, you know, I always say not all things, some things are just not your cup of tea. And you would be better served if you considered learning that person's native language, or, you know, learning something about another country in some cases, rather than slang. It's not to say that you can't use slang, because we all use slang, but just be mindful of that. And so some people say at this point, in fact, we had one person the last time we did our presentation say early on, well, what can I say? Do I just not talk? What do I do? Well, we all have to talk. And we all just have to be mindful of what we say. And if you're not sure about what you're going to say, then keep quiet for a little bit, and then the words will come, hopefully. And you might take your cue from someone else and know what the tone of the conversation should be. So don't be afraid to talk. We all, you know, that's the way we communicate, but just watch what you say and how you say it, if at all possible.
Well, and just to add to that, when you're thinking about what you can and cannot say, or whether or not you should speak out or not, whether it's related to colloquialism or outside of that, is if you're going to follow someone else's lead, make sure that what they're saying is also accurate. One
Absolutely.
thing I've seen a lot in the marketplace, which is, it's been a lot of my hours have been spent on this, is I'm seeing a lot of people in the marketplace, they see a post on social media and it says, this person is a racist, and then everybody jumps and goes, oh my God, they're a racist. Nobody does the research, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but it's our responsibility to do our homework and see if what is being said is true. Or if someone says, hold on, I'm looking at chats.
Something about singing.
Someone says, sometimes at the studio, people are singing along to the song and using slang that isn't for them. How do we address it, or do we? Well, I think that's a great question. Rosalind, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it? Totally up to you.
We can do a tag team on it. I mean, I think nowadays there's a lot of songs that have slang in it. I mean, and in fact, some of our slang comes from songs. I just think that if you find it offensive, you maybe first of all think about why you find it offensive, and then it's okay to have a conversation with someone, a nice conversation, to talk about how you feel about something. But again, I think a lot of the songs that are out, we get words from them. We're now using some of the words in the song that we get, some of the slang. So that's one aspect of it.
I think also I'm trying to, can you guys see me again? Hold on, I'm trying to pull you back because sometimes I like to look at people. I think especially when it comes to something like this, because this can be a very meaningful conversation, but it can also be a very emotional conversation. It can be an offensive conversation, depending on how the conversation takes place and how it may be received or communicated. So what I like to do is I like to spend time and talk to people about how to have hard conversations. You can use this approach whether you're, okay, so someone said, Kaylee said, I mean specifically the N-word. I will tell you right now, okay, I'm not
a fan of it, I'll tell you that right now.
I will tell you right now, I would have a real problem with that. And let me talk about what the stages are to have a hard conversation, and then I'm going to throw it all out the window and show you how I would respond to that. So don't let me forget to circle back to that. So when it comes to having hard conversations, what I want you to keep in mind is that conversations are hard, not just for the person who's initiating the hard conversation, but the person who's listening to it. Because think about when somebody says to you, I need to talk to you about something. You don't think the next thing they're going to say is, we're retiring for the rest of our lives and we'll never have to work again. Or someone says, I made dinner. Nobody, when someone says we need to talk or we need to have a conversation, there's nothing good that comes after that. It's always going to be a hard conversation, right? So what I always like to look at is before I have a hard conversation, I will sit down. I used to be one of those people who used to say, I want to have like these great experiences in life. I want to experience everything life has to offer. And I would get challenge after challenge after challenge. And I'd have to have all these hard conversations because I was having all these meaningful experiences. And then finally I started saying, okay, I just want to have fun because this is getting way too hard. But I got really good at hard conversations. So one of the things I always start with is I get really clear about what my intention is. Why do I want to have this conversation? Is it that I want somebody to understand? Do I want to feel heard? Do I want a different outcome? Do I want to make somebody feel bad? What is it? And you have to be really honest about what that is. It doesn't mean that's what your intention needs to stay, but the more responsibility we take for our part in it, the more confident we'll feel and in control about what our words are and how they're going to land. So get really clear about what your objective or what your intention is. The second part is when you're going to have a hard conversation with someone, and we'll use this as an example. Let's just say there was somebody who was singing something and they used the N-word and it was offensive, or even they just said something offensive and it had nothing to do with music. Instead of saying, hey, not cool, I'm gonna this, I'm gonna that, or threaten or just flip out, that's where I would take a beat because I wouldn't want to respond emotionally, and I would write out everything that happened. And that's where I can say, I was offended, I was annoyed, I was pissed off, I was this, I was that. But then once I write all of that out and I get it out, all on paper or on a Word document, then I'm going to cross out everything that's emotional. And I'm only going to keep things that are factual. And the reason I do that is because I can get all my emotions out on paper or on a document, but now I can focus on the facts. Because either someone did or didn't say the N-word, or they did or didn't say something that's offensive. And so instead of just saying, hey, I thought I heard you, da 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 da, or you do this all the time, if there's nothing to back it up, if there's nothing substantial, that's when you get into the dangerous area of fighting over feelings again.
I'm also going to say something else, piggybacking on that. I think also the timing of it. In other words, I love what Gina said about writing everything down, but you may want to take a deep breath and wait for a time where you're not as emotional, because you may come at that person with more aggression than you normally would, and it's not going to be a productive conversation. So you have to take the time to figure out when you're going to address the person.
And that's why you want to write this out, so that you do get the emotion out. Writing it out
Right.
helps you release a lot of that emotion. It can be a very cathartic experience. So once you get that all out, when you sit down to have that conversation, you won't be as emotional. You may have other moments leading up to that, but if you go and you follow this format, you will be able to have a productive conversation. It's also important to ask the person, is now a good time? Because you don't want to ask somebody when they're super stressed out or their life is falling apart or it's not the right time. Not that means that your needs have to wait until it's an appropriate time for somebody else. But you may say, if someone says it's not a good time, I'm running off to a meeting. Okay, when would be a good time? Let's get something on the calendar. That's okay. So then the next part of that, and this to me is probably the second most critical part to having hard conversations. And it's the hardest part for me, which is to take responsibility for our part in a situation. Because the truth is, we all have a part in a situation. That does not mean that because somebody says something that's offensive to you, that you deserved that you earned it, or that you're responsible for it. But if you don't let people know that that's not acceptable, then you are participating in it. So that's how you look at, how am I participating in this? Well, by being angry and not saying anything, I'm not resolving the issue. I'm festering, and that's not good for me. So how do I want to respond to that? What do I want my responsibility to be? And then the last part would be to ask for what you want. And if you're not sure about what you want, go back to your intention. Your intention tells you what you want. And if you're not sure where to start, that's when you get all Freaky Friday and you put yourself in the other person's shoes and you have that conversation, or start that conversation in the way that you would want someone to start the conversation with you. I hear what Rosalind is saying, that if you like yourself, you're going to be nice to yourself. But the truth is, the majority of us do not sit there and think about whether we like ourselves and how we would talk to ourselves. We think about how we would want someone to talk to us, not how we, because listen, we all have those moments where we look in front of a mirror and we're like, what are you doing? Right? So we want to look at it from the perspective of, how would we want someone delivering this kind of information or this kind of hard conversation to us?
May I ask a question that's very specific to what we do?
Sure.
And I think this is going to piggyback on what Bronwyn just typed. We teach dance, and many of so we have a playlist. There are 13 songs in a playlist.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to count every word in the 13 songs that could be offensive to particular parties in the room, I might not have a playlist, or I might be down to maybe 3. And then if that playlist were, if I were going to make a playlist that was that restrictive, then I wouldn't be hitting every what we consider erotic creature. So we want to appeal to who our audience is. So I don't mean to offend my students at all,
Mm-hmm.
but I certainly want to do what we do.
Well, it sounds to me like you want to deliver a great experience, right? They're paying to have this great experience. You want to deliver what they've paid for and then some, but you also don't want to be offensive.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So remember at the
Also,
I want to be.
I'm also gonna. Can I chime in and
Yes.
tweak it from the other direction as well?
Yeah.
Just to kind of take it back to Brittany's original question, if students are singing along to songs or singing like in the lobby area, I think there's just a kind of unique, it's not like a typical workplace, right? Where like if a coworker says that word, I feel much more equipped to have that conversation. Whereas if it's a student and I'm a teacher who's trying to create a safe space for everybody, or if you're working at the front desk and these are our customers, I think it's a slightly different just situation in terms of how to address it with a paying customer / student in this particular setting, which Deborah described.
Right. So what is it? So what is the appropriate way to, do we address it, or do we say we're in a particular situation? This is very different than your other workplace.
No, because here's what I think will happen.
Specific.
No, I'm going to answer your question. Here's what I think will happen. If you address that in every single class that you're teaching, people, that's going to get old pretty fast, not just for you, but for the people who are like, oh, here comes the disclaimer. Just like when we get on a plane and people talk about the safety video, right? We want people to understand that this is important and why it's important and why we have a safe environment where everyone feels included and welcome. And I think the best way to do that is to have something that's either, you can put it up in the studio, it can be part of the student's welcome packet when they sign in, you can have it on a flyer or someplace in there that says, we use a diverse selection of music. Sometimes there are words that may be explicit. If you are easily offended, let the instructor know ahead of time. She can review the playlist with you, and then you can make the decision from there. We can word it so that it's more appropriate. But I think it goes back to what I was saying before, that when we set expectations up front, that helps us avoid crisis that doesn't necessarily need to happen. Because now it's up to the student. Some students may say, oh, that's cool, I get it. When I'm here, that's when I can listen to that music and I can be in my movement and working with my instructor. And when I'm out, I'm not there. Some people may say, this isn't the right class for me. And that's okay too, because you also don't want people in there who may impact the experience for the other people who are okay with being there. Does that help?
So I'm the person who originally typed the question, and kind of just to like narrow again what Bronwyn says, like if there's a student who's like singing along to Kanye West, they're using the N-word. As a teacher or someone who's at the front desk, how do you tell that person, a paying customer, hey, just so you know, it's offensive when you sing the N-word? You know what I mean? Like, because if I was out in the regular world, I mean, outside of S Factor, and I heard that, I would tell that person, this is why it offended me that you sang along to that song, as opposed to like some students being affected by the music in the class hasn't been as much of the issue as we've had students. Well, I've had students come to me being like, I feel really uncomfortable with 12 elite white women saying da 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 da, N-word, N-word, N-word. And it doesn't make me feel safe that they all feel comfortable enough to just be shouting this in this class. You know what I mean?
But
so how do we handle that from the business side of like making it like, hey guys, maybe, you know, I thought more people knew that you shouldn't use that word, but apparently not.
Well, hold on a second, because see, this is what I mean by see how it starts to get it. If we start to move into the emotion around it and the offensiveness of it, then we're going to get into an emotional conversation. And I'm not saying that we don't want to have a conversation about it. I just want to be clear about what is it that we're trying to accomplish here. And I completely hear you, and I would find it offensive too if I heard somebody saying that as a woman or a woman of color. Even though I'm not Black, that's not a word that I care for. And I have a very strong reaction to it. In a business setting, you have to take a couple of things into consideration. One is, if you're going to have that policy that says, this is the kind of music we use, you may hear words that may be offensive. You can say, we ask that you be considerate. If you know, like, we love a good sing-along, but we ask that you be considerate in the words that you're using. You cannot tell somebody, unless you make it a policy, that nobody sings in class, but I don't know how you're going to do that. That's not going to be a whole lot of fun for people.
No.
But if you allow people to sing, you also have to remember that there's freedom of speech. So you have to decide what's the policy of the organization or of the company. So if you tell people you can't sing, you're going to have a problem. But you can tell people, look, this is what we play, and here's what we want you to take into consideration. And we also want you to take into consideration, you know, how it may impact others. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Does that answer the question? Yeah, anybody still feel stuck on it?
Do you have any tips on how to have that conversation one-on-one as an employee of S Factor to a student outside of like written studio policy?
Is it somebody that you would have a relationship with where you could have a conversation, or is it somebody like, do you not have close?
I would say that in the studio setting, we have relationships with all of the students in some form.
So it would be okay to have a conversation with somebody. It wouldn't be like totally out of the ordinary.
I would say no.
Okay.
I mean, I guess there would be a circumstance where in the shared space, like in the lobby, might be a student that I don't personally know. So yeah, there is a scenario where it would be somebody I don't have a personal relationship with.
Okay. Someone's asking about Facebook. I don't know if that's related to this, but I'll come back to it, Nadia. If it was someone that I had a relationship with, this is how I like to approach things like that. I will say, if it's okay, I'd like to give, are you open to some feedback? People have a choice. They can say yes or no. People usually say yes, but they're terrified of what's going to come next. And then I would say, look, I don't want to say anything to be offensive or to make you feel bad, but I would want to know. I would want someone to communicate this to me and then say, I just want to let you know that when this happened, be aware that sometimes that can be considered offensive and this is why. And then go back to, again, not to, my goal is not to offend you or put you off. I just thought you may want to be aware because I know I would want to be aware. So see how it's non-threatening, but if it's part of the policy, then you can say, we have a policy that we do have this music and we just ask that people take it into consideration or just be considerate of other people.
I think the wording of the disclaimer is going to be really important, because one thing that someone can do is come back and say, well, you're the one that's playing it. So, why can't I say the word? So I think that needs to be addressed in a disclaimer.
Well, and that's where freedom of speech comes in, right? So we have to be clear about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, because we still have to consider, yes, company policies, but then you have freedom of speech, and we can't. Right. Now, I'm not saying that makes it okay. Listen, if somebody came into my house and said it, that would not be okay. If somebody yelled it from the middle of my street, it would not be okay. But for me, from a legality standpoint, they can say whatever they want in the middle of the street, right? So we have to look at what's the policy, and if we want to revise it. And Sheila and Eileen, we can talk after today, and we can even look at this and see if there's something that we want to put together that's in place, just as some guidelines for the team, if that would be helpful. Yeah? Okay. Is that helpful for everyone?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and Nadia, where's Nadia? Because Nadia's been in my email inbox. I don't see you. Okay, so Nadia was asking if it's okay to have the conversations over Facebook.
No, sorry, I was just trying to clarify, that might be a very common place where we have a lot of relationships with our students, but might not have a deep personal relationship where we hang out with them. Often we're friends with them on Facebook, so that might be an opportunity to initiate that conversation.
I'd be careful for two reasons. One, from a legal standpoint, you're not protected on Facebook. And two, I would be a little hesitant to do it on Facebook and writing, because that kind of conversation, in my opinion, should be done like this. It should be a verbal conversation, because you get misconstrued in writing, and you want to try to avoid.
That's a great point.
And I can see where someone could share something and they get a whole, conversation going with other people. Next thing you know, they make you out to be something that you aren't.
And I think this is very similar to the other thing when somebody comes into the studio, that they have certain expectations of what could possibly happen in this journey. Perhaps it's going to bring up some emotional things. Perhaps it's going to be, something that's difficult to deal with. Perhaps you're going to hear some music that you might find offensive. We just never really addressed the perhaps X, Y, and Z could happen. So maybe if we were just to lay it out, it doesn't have to be specific and detailed, but it just could be very broad, that these things could possibly happen on this journey that you're about to embark on. So
I think you raise a great
to address it.
Well, I think we could even take it a step further, and we could create a code of conduct. Which
we have.
You do have a code of conduct? Okay, so we may even want to look at your current code of conduct and see where there's an opportunity to update it somewhat. Okay. And then you guys will feel better prepared and informed, because you'll have something to back you up. Does that feel better? Okay. Okay, I made a note. Did I get, okay, you need to sign. I'm going through all the questions to make sure. Did I miss anybody's questions? No, we're good. Okay. So let's go back to any questions on how to have hard conversations. If not, I'll go back to some screen sharing. Okay, let's go back here. All right. So we're not going to talk about colloquialism again. So now what? So listen to what's being said as well as what's not being said. A lot of times I'll notice that people are saying something, but if you're watching their body language, you can tell there's somewhere else or there's something else going on. So pay attention to that as well. Also, don't assume that what was said was understood and vice versa. So that was when I was saying earlier, you know, it's okay to ask for clarification, or when we were talking about active listening, to say, let me make sure I understand. Also be mindful and aware of not just your environment or who you're talking to, but also what you're saying in your body language and how you're showing up, because sometimes we're uncomfortable delivering a message, and it can show up in our body language and it can be misinterpreted. Mm-hmm. So sometimes what I'll even do is, if I'm having a difficult conversation with someone, I'll say, this is really hard for me. I'm really uncomfortable. And usually what happens is the other person goes, oh my God, me too. I feel like this is really uncomfortable. And then suddenly we have something to bond over as we move through this conversation. Be open to another interpretation, meaning, or even an understanding of a situation. And what I mean by that is sometimes we'll take an experience, and then we'll take our history of experiences or our series of experiences and take that to mean something or apply it to a current situation. But sometimes I find it super helpful to stop and go, okay, so I can respond the way I normally respond, but is there another way to see this? And sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Most of the time there is. And if you're still unclear or uncertain, it's always better to assume that you don't understand than to assume that you do. So this is when I say do some research, rather than making the assumption that you know what you're talking about or that you'll just wing it. What happens is you end up putting yourself at risk, and you could potentially offend others. So I like to tell people to listen, like if you're not sure, and I will tell you, I'm not somebody who, I've always made it a policy in my career not to respond publicly to things around like political situations or things that are happening in media. As it relates to the marketplace, yes, but as it relates outside of my business, I don't, simply because I am very opinionated, and that can influence my market, and I never want to offend anyone or put somebody off because of my own beliefs. So I try to, when I'm quiet about things or I'm gathering information, is I listen with curiosity so that I can respond with compassion. So I'll ask questions, and not necessarily externally. Sometimes I'll be reading something that someone's posted, or I'm watching something and I'm learning something. I'm watching people interact in a conversation. And if I don't know what I'm talking about, or I don't have the information to back me up, I'll listen from a point of education to help me learn and gather as much information as possible. But I'll also listen to how this person is responding as a human being. And that's where I look to connect. I look to find things that we find in common, so that the other person or people can understand that I'm really trying to learn, and I'm trying to find commonalities, not ways to further divide us. We don't have to like or disagree, or I'm sorry, we don't have to like or agree with other things, but if we can understand where it comes from, and this is what I was saying about seeing things from another perspective, it could change our response or even our opinion or belief system. Going back to what we said earlier about using reflective listening, so let me make sure I understand. And then this is really important, because I want to make sure everyone knows, especially before we hang up, you've got to accept the fact that you will make mistakes. We are all human beings. The goal is to resolve to learn from them and to make an active decision to do better. That's where it's our responsibility. We will make mistakes, but it's what happens after that mistake that is going to make or break how we move forward, or the relationship, or how we've impacted someone. So really be thoughtful when you make a mistake. How can I learn from it? How can I benefit from it? How can I do better or make a relationship or an impact better? Okay, let's look at what else you can do. So you can establish and maintain or work in a company culture that supports equality, inclusivity, and diversity. if you notice, we didn't focus on one specific area. And the reason is, one of the things I'm seeing a lot in the marketplace, especially right now, is how there's been a conversation around race, and a lot of businesses and companies think that if they solve the race issue, then they can go back to business as usual. That's not how this works. Talking about race is the start of the conversation. It is not the solution. So really be clear that you want to create an environment where everyone feels welcome, everyone. And if you're not sure on who everyone is, go back to the original part where we talked about the classifications on equality. Also create and maintain compassionate leadership, and then promote it throughout your team so that it shows up in all of your customer or client relationships. When you can create a sense of belonging, it ups the experience, like increases it, not just intellectually, but emotionally, because people feel the difference. I ran a mastermind for a number of years, and what I found was people could feel the difference when we were on the calls. If somebody was in a different place, or somebody had something else going on, or if somebody wasn't meeting with the right vibe with the rest of the group, they could just feel it just by being in that same environment. So also be really aware of the energy that you bring to a conversation, a situation, an environment, and celebrate the differences. Share experiences within your own team, and share and show how it changes your experience and the experience that you create for others. By learning from each other, we can do so much more. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about how it impacts business from also a profit level. Also look beyond quotas. So it's not just about filling a spot, like saying, oh, we need a diversity, somebody that represents a different race or that represents diversity here. It's not just about filling a spot or reaching a number or even a statistics. It's really about hiring the best candidate for the best position. So I had a conversation recently with a client who said that there was something that happened where someone said something about her having a coach who's Latinx or Latina. And I started laughing, and I said, well, you didn't hire a Latina coach. You hired a coach who happens to be of Latin descent. So I was the most qualified. I just happened to be of a different race. So the bottom line is you want to treat people like people. So here's what you do after this training is what matters most. So think about how you're going to take what you've learned today and how you're going to put it into action, consistent daily action. Even if you take one action a day and you think about something that you learned or how it shows up. The next time you reach for your phone in a meeting to look at the time, or the next time you notice yourself sighing when you're having a conversation with someone, you're going to have a different response. You may even have a different response before you reach for the phone or let that sigh come out verbally. Also focus on fun, not fear. This is one of the things, is that we get so fearful about how to behave or how to show up. But if we do our homework and we do our research, we can promote and celebrate diversity as well as inclusivity. So celebrate what makes us different versus promoting fear of what makes us different, okay? Another thing a lot of companies do is they update their brand. So how they promote equality, inclusivity, and diversity, looking at things like your images on your branding, right? Do you see lots of people who look very different, or do you see lots of people who look very similar? And I'll give you a quick example. I'm in the middle of a redesign for my website, and I wanted a picture for my homepage that had a stock image that had a number of different faces that represented different cultures, age, sex, or gender, everything. And when I went to look for just a stock photo image, after 90 minutes, what I found was I was using tags like diversity, faces, people, urban, culture. And what I found is a lot of stock photo companies think that if you take 9 images and 8 of them are white men and you put a black woman in there, that's diversity. Some of them think that if you take a dozen white people who have different color skin and hair, that is diversity. So we have a real thing around how can we improve? How can we all do better? And we all have a responsibility in that. We tend to leave things for our leaders to take care of it, but we all have a responsibility in this because we all make the world happen. We make it go round. And as I said earlier, you always want to look at, you know, some of you are in hiring and interviewing positions where you're looking to hire talent. So recruit from a wide talent pool so that you can hire the best candidates. Questions or comments before I keep going? Okay. And above all, remember this. There is no person any more or less important than anyone else. And if we embrace the very things that make us different as a way to bring ourselves together, then there's no telling what else we can do. Because that's what equality is, and that's inclusivity, and that's diversity. That's all of us. So, one more thing. Oh no, is it not gonna let me do this? Hold on. Okay, so here is a little something, a little break.
And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. Even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. 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 She keeps me warm.
My heart doesn't see race. Love has no age limit.
We are neighbors and best friends.
We all have different religions, but we have universal love as well.
Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
All right, I'm bringing you guys back. Oh, wait, no, hold on. Everyone stay calm. Okay, I lost for a second. Look, did you guys like that video? I love that video. Every time, I have to tell you, the advantage of doing this video and this training is that you guys can't see me every single time. And I've watched this I'm probably several million of these views on this video. I cry every single time because I'm so moved by it. And that's what we have the opportunity to create. That's what we're all a part of. If we all participate in that same way, think about how fast your community would change, our community would change, how we would all be able to change things for the better. I'm going to unmute you because I see a hand up.
I want to say, I remember seeing that ad for the first time. I think it came out a couple years ago.
Yeah.
But I did notice in the ad that it specifically says, "My heart doesn't see race." And we had the slide earlier about how we don't say that anymore. So I just,
but no, that's not what we said.
Not your heart.
I don't see race. Heart
right.
is different. Heart doesn't see, heart feels. So see,
No, I know, but I just, I
Ironic.
did actually like cringe at it a little bit.
Me too.
So it's just funny that like even my perception of the ad has changed in the 2 years since I first saw it. So.
it's funny that you say that because they did a series of ads, and it's at the ad council is who did this promo. And if you go to their YouTube channel, you'll see a few of them. And it's interesting you say that because there were 3 that were a part of the original training, and when I went back and watched one of them, I was like, oh yeah, that doesn't apply anymore. We got to take that out. So that goes back to, and I love that you brought this up, it goes back to the earlier point of how fast things can also change. This video is not, like you said, I think it was 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So that's how fast things can change. Questions or comments?
Which is kind of like when you buy the brand new piece of computer or whatever, you walk out and you go, I've got the latest, greatest thing. And then tomorrow it's like, oh, that dinosaur, you purchased that yesterday? What are you talking about? So it's
right.
How do you always keep up? I don't know.
I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, you have to make an active effort. I would hate to say to you like, oh, it's so easy. I mean, I would love to tell you, oh, it's so easy. But the truth is, Rosalind and I are constantly, every morning, I spend an hour just looking online at what's happening in the marketplace as it relates to these 3 key areas. What are people talking about? What are the conversations? What's the terminology? Because I have to do that as part of my job every single day. If I didn't have to do that, if that wasn't part of what I do, I don't know. I would love to tell you that I would make the active investment every day, but it is a practice. But if you are having conversations with people and you are keeping yourself informed and having meaningful conversations, you will start to stay informed without having to invest that hour every single morning.
And you're going to also find that out in the world, you're going to constantly see things and think, well, that wasn't exactly right what they said. And if it's someone close to you, you might gently remind them. I always say I'm always increasing my emotional intelligence. I'm a work in progress.
So thanks, Rosalind. I want to address a question. So someone said, the ad is wonderful. I have a question about being a leader when there is pushback from the company on things like terminology. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So I've worked for this company for a lot of years, and we use terminology to describe some of our movements that I have used unconsciously, and they have suddenly become conscious for me. Things like a movement called a frisk, which I once found myself looking like me in a class that was, I think there was only one other Caucasian person. Everyone else was either African-American or Latina. And also a term like peanut gallery. And I know that I am far, far, far from the first person to raise these questions. And it's been my impression that that conversation has been shut down.
So here's, I think this is a great question. So let me acknowledge that first. This kind of goes back to what we were talking earlier too. I'm sure when those terms were initially brought into the coursework, it probably was okay to use terminology like that. So now where there's an opportunity, we were talking about updating brand, this may be a time where we say, you know, we used to use the term frisk, but this is what we're going to start using now so that it's more friendly or more gender neutral or more appropriate. Someone says we have an update on that as part of the Cultural Advisory Committee. Okay, perfect. Nadia, do you want to share on that? Okay.
Hi. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that Elizabeth and Coco and I, we were taking a look at the curriculum and kind of combing through to make sure that we're looking at, terminology that is problematic, and we're working with Allie to get a lot of that content updated. So Jessica, thank you for raising that. It's definitely on the radar. And if others have other concerns that they didn't raise or didn't get a chance to raise in the survey, please reach out to us, because we want to make sure that we're covering everything. Like, we're just 3 people, 3 perspectives.
Sure.
So, oh, I lost light. You guys have, you know, more red flags. We're totally ears to hear all of that.
I really appreciate that, and I do understand that that's something that's been in the works. I've also just experienced a lot of frustration around the fact that, you know, I was part of getting the company to add an all gender class to our curriculum, and I feel like there has been zero support from the company, and I think that that is an internal bias we have because we've been a studio that was a movement for women, but you know, if this is a safe space, I will say I'm very frustrated. I can't get anybody to sub the class for me when I'm sick. I can't get anybody to promote the class. I can keep tweeting it at the same 100 people. And so I feel like, you know, this is a place where I feel like I'm up against a brick wall. And Gina and Rosalind, I don't know how to have that conversation. I've had it, and I could go talk to the wall back here too. I feel like that'd be just about as successful, you know. And this is what I'm talking about pushback from within the company. Like we can have all of these wonderful ideas around having these conversations, but when they don't go anywhere, how do you turn to someone who is your client and say, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you, or I can't help you?
Yeah, and I'm sure that feeling has to be pretty frustrating.
It's incredibly crappy.
Okay, so let's talk about something for a second. When those conversations were happening, it was prior to the training today, right?
Certainly, yes.
So would you be open, and I know we don't know each other, so I'm asking you to trust me, which there's no reason for you to trust me, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Would you be open to trusting me to have a conversation with management where we talk about, okay, so let's look at this. Is it appropriate for the branding? Is this something, and how do we make this something where it does, the class does feel supported, not just the students, but the participation and how it's set up, and where, you know, if you have to miss a class, that there is a backup. And that we also look at it like there may be a new market there to open up to, right? And that could be a new revenue stream.
I would very much like to have that conversation with you.
It may, and it may not be, I'm not going to tell you, oh, you know, we can solve this and it's going to be a quick conversation, everything's going to be easy, because I haven't had a conversation with anyone. But what I think a lot of times what happens is, and I'm not saying that this is the case here or that it isn't the case here, because I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, and I certainly don't want to put anyone on the spot. But a lot of times what happens, and this is just reality, this is the truth. A lot of times people are afraid to make changes, or they're concerned or resistant to make changes because they don't know what the impact is, because they're not informed yet. Mm-hmm. And so we've just spent almost 2 hours uncovering a lot of material, and you're probably going to walk away from this and you're going to be like, wow, we ran through that pretty fast. But things are going to land on you throughout the week, and things, and as you go on and as you're having different experiences, that's an opportunity for you to have conversations with each other. If there are questions that come up and we need to schedule something, you know, where there's a Q&A and there's more dialogue, I can certainly have that conversation with Sheila and Eileen, and we can look at that. But if you could give me a week to have a conversation with Eileen and Sheila and anybody else we need to include, and talk about, okay, what has been the challenge before, and has that changed since the training, and what's the outcome?
Absolutely.
Would that be, is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
Hi, this is Liz. Am I heard?
Hi. Yes.
Hi. Sorry, I'm driving to the studio because I'm going to teach at 7. But okay. I have all the survey responses from everyone. We had 26 women reply. Out of 40 that I sent it to, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the terms that you brought up, Jess, with Peanut Gallery, with the he seed. So we are having a conversation with Allie about that next week. And then there was a huge amount of concern and anxiety about introducing men to the studio. Not just, some people were like, well, we want to introduce men. Whether or not people felt it was appropriate to introduce men, just a huge amount of anxiety about how to teach men. And so that's something I also really look forward to discussing with Allie and with management and with you also, Gina, to make sure that especially for they were rolling out curriculum updates for existing teachers and also for the teacher training in September that they are culturally competent.
I think
I have a question for you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
That was Rosalind.
Oh,
question for you. So you aren't teaching men at all now?
We are. They've kind of come to us as we have a new platform, a new app that lets us have our students sign in and out of class. We also show up in a monthly class pass. So a few of them have come to us, and I have taken co-ed classes, so I volunteered to teach. I think we can do more, and I think that there is a way to approach it so that it fits with the culture of the studio. But people are coming to us. Why are we turning away customers if people want to learn what we teach? And I feel like that's where I've been hitting a little bit of a wall.
Well, and some of it could be, and I don't know, so, we'll find this out when I have the conversation, but if training is an issue, maybe, I heard earlier, not knowing how to train them.
Yeah.
Because, if that is the issue, that's a different issue than it's a gender thing. It affects gender, but then we have to look at, okay, so what would have to be overcome in order to make this an inclusive environment where everyone feels confident, not just coming to the studio, but also educating and training your customers so that they have your students so that they have a great experience. So, so we want to uncover all of those pieces of it. I hear you loud and clear. And here's one of the things I want you to know. Brittany, I see you, so I'll get to you in just a quick second. Is one of the things we see with companies that, and there are lots of statistics on this, and when you get a copy of the presentation, you'll see it in there as well, is the statistics that show, I think it's 60% of companies who start to incorporate inclusivity, equality, and diversity into their organization, 60% of them see a spike in revenue. I believe it's 7 or 9% of them find a brand new market. So there are, aside from just being like a decent human being, right, doing the right thing, there's also money to be made, and there's a financial benefit when you bring this into your business. Brittany.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of like piggyback or, double up on what Jess said. I feel like part of what the frustration has been not feeling heard by management, because her all genders class has been something, and from what I understand, has been in the talks about the studio for several years. And then the fact that it's on a Friday in the middle of the day, it's not conducive to a time to attract new clientele. And I work at BuzzFeed, which is an extremely queer company. And I have a lot of people who are interested in taking it. They all work at that time. Or we're having a workshop, like a showcase next Friday. And we have a couple a year. Usually there's only one that invites both genders, but several people have expressed, I have other people who are not women who are interested in this movement and would like to come. We just don't have very many opportunities for that. And even though I'm newer to this company, it feels like sometimes even when that gets brought up to management, it has felt shut down. So I just wanted to support Jess in what she's saying. And if there's anything I can add to any kind of conversations, and I know it is a work in progress and a learning thing. And sometimes it's just this is the scheduled time that we have, but it doesn't feel like the company's super behind us if we're putting the class at a place where the target demographic who'd be interested in it can't attend it. And the feedback that we're getting from people is saying, hey, we're interested. This doesn't work from us. And we only have so many hours in the day. We only have so many times, but how can we work together so it feels like, yes, this is a thing that actually we want to do. And this is an area we are trying to grow and expand in, not just lip service of you guys said you wanted one, here you go.
Right. I hear you loud and clear. I think what needs to happen, and I don't see Sheila, but I still see Eileen. Sheila and Eileen, if you're open to having a conversation, the three of us, we can talk about this, because what it sounds like we need to be clear on, and this is a much longer conversation. I'm going to hold on. Oh, you are unmuted. Go ahead, Eileen.
Yeah, I wanted to respond and say to Jessica, I hear you, and this is something that there are conversations happening around, and I would definitely be open to talking to you about it anytime. I would love to hear your ideas, and we can talk about what the other side our concerns are, and maybe we can come up with a really great plan that would be beneficial to everybody.
Thank you.
Because I think if there's a conversation that takes place around like, what is the opportunity? And not just what is the opportunity with the answer being, oh, we can have men in the class, but that we look at like, what would that look like? What would it take for us to offer this? But also what would be the outcome? And is this a market that when we look at it, we see what, you know, what the impact and the benefits are, we may look and say, thanks, Elizabeth, that this is something that we want to pursue. And if it is something we want to pursue, then we want to get strategic about it, where we say, okay, well, if this is the demographic, what's the time and the date that suits them? And it may be like, oh, well, Friday afternoons in the middle of the day don't work, but Saturdays at noon are great. I'm just making up a time. Or that doesn't work, or we need a couple of things. So we want to look at all of that and not just from one perspective. So if you can give us a little time, we'll have a conversation and come back to you. Kaylee, I see you. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, since I am in charge of making the studio schedule, that the conversations are already in the works. And we, this month, already moved it from it being every other week to every single week. And I'm hoping to eventually, like for September, get it moved to a weekend day so it's more doable. There's just some communications that have to be taking place between myself and Eileen in order to make sure that it's at the right place on the schedule.
Yeah, and you know, one of the other things I feel like I would love S Factor to be a more welcoming space for is not just cis men in the class, but I know that I've heard from trans women, I've heard from non-binary folks who would love to explore their feminine. And so that I think is, you know, part of the community. I would love that class to be able to reach out to.
So I think it's worth it. I'll get right back to you. Hold on one second, because I just want to say this before I forget, because I'm older than you and I'll forget. I think it's important for us to have the conversation about it, because as I understand it, right now, S Factor is a movement for women. So what that does is if you, and I'm not saying that we don't change it or that you don't change it, but what I'm saying is if you change it, it changes the direction of the whole business. So it's a bigger conversation than do we add a class. So I just want to be clear about that so that you understand it's not a quick yes or no, let's do it. There are a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration. I'm not saying no. I just want you to know there's more to it than just a yes or no.
The thing painted on the wall is the movement of the feminine. So that's not gendered.
Oh, it says of the feminine? Okay.
Yeah.
My understanding is that a lot of the, but we'll look at it. I mean, I think you bring up a great point. So let's look at it.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Kaylee.
And then something that I just wanted to just like put out there is that we, especially in like our women's classes, we accept trans women in all shapes and sizes in it. We just haven't, from what I've seen, had much interest. Like we've had a couple people here and there, but we just really I haven't heard much from anybody with interest in our classes.
But also know that if it hasn't been marketed and people don't know that it's there, they're not necessarily going to bring it up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like having a restaurant that says it's open, but they never tell anybody.
Right. I also just want to express, as someone coming from a marginalized place, if you don't feel that the place that you're seeking out is a safe space for you, that is also part of it. And especially people with gender identity and how they're presenting, like we had an issue where we're like, if the person was trans and presenting with more feminine traits, we would let them into class. But if they were trans and presenting more as a cis male, what do we say? And that was a big debate of like, how do we handle that and approach that? Because these are now terms that are in our zeitgeist and that we have to address, and people are asking questions. And at the end of the day, we want everyone to feel safe and welcome. And I don't want to re-traumatize someone by not creating a space where they feel welcomed to explore the feminine end, no matter what their outside presentation is. And I feel like we're all on board for that. It's just like, how are we communicating that? How are we marketing that? How are we getting the people who need that information of like, this, you will not be harmed by coming here.
Well, and I think you raise a good point. And here's how this gets addressed. We start with things like this training and this conversation. It is not something that you're going to fix by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I wish it was that easy. If it were, we'd live in a very different world. But the reality is we don't. But what seems very, very clear to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is a group of people who collectively really want to make this a great place to work and a great place to come and be a student.
Yes.
That everybody genuinely cares.
Yeah, I can tell that from the questions that you're asking and the comments you're making.
So what we've done is we've started a really meaningful conversation and to look at some really interesting things like opening up a new market, updating code of conduct, looking at some of the terminology and revising things. This is all, like all of these things that you've all brought up, this could not happen without your input and without your feedback. But we're going to take some time to look at it and say, okay, these are the things that got brought up. How do we want to address this? Not just for this specific issue, but how do we want to address it for the business as a whole and the direction that it's moving, so that it's not just a Band-Aid, but that we're also moving towards future business development and making sure that it's in alignment with the business goals. Does that make sense? Anyway, I know we're over time and I want to get everybody off the phone or off Zoom within the next 5 minutes. Does anybody have anything they want to add before we wrap up?
Can I
do. I have something sort of general. I think
like,
that.
Oh, there you are. Sorry. I'm like, where is she? Where is she?
Is that if maybe, you know, I think some of us have heightened emotions about certain things. If maybe we could just take a breath and realize that when Sheila started this movement 17 years ago, nobody was talking about empowering the feminine. No one was talking about having pride in being female. So we have 17 years have passed, and every day something new develops, and there are new changes, and people are becoming more accepting and more loving and more embracing of their differences, and really good things are happening. So if we could just realize where we came from and have a vision as to where we're going to go, and everybody realize that we're here to support one another and make it all inclusive for everybody, we maybe feel better or perhaps.
Yeah, I think this is, well, first I want to say this to all of you. Thank you. Thank you for being so open. Thank you for sharing your feelings and your thoughts and your experiences. I think, you know, like what you were saying earlier about Sheila starting the movement 17 years ago, a lot has happened in 17 years. And I remember when Sheila started the movement, because you're right, nobody was talking about this. That's why it had such a huge impact, because everybody was like, what is all of this? She's like being in touch with your sexuality and like being proud of it stuff. It was so, like, that was so jarring for a lot of women and men, and, you know, at different ages, because it was so different than what we were used to. Now it's more commonplace, and so the conversation changes again and again and again and again, because that's how we evolve. But so here's what I'm going to say, and then we're really going to wrap up. Is a couple of things. One is, for anybody who's watching the recording, if you stay on, you will see the intro, because I'm going to redo the intro since I missed the recording at the very beginning. But also, I have a tradition that I love to do whenever I do a group session together. And what I'd like to do is have everybody go around the room and share one word, the video, share one word that describes your experience or how you're feeling after the training today. So Eileen has something she wants to say first, so I'll let her go.
Can I just ask, right before we all sign off, can I just read the list of everyone who's on, so I make sure that I have everyone included? Just do a quick read through.
Sure, go ahead.
I can do it at the very end if you'd prefer.
No, go ahead. You're good.
Lynn, Kaylee, Brittany, Laura, Chelsea, Allie King, Jessica, Hopper, Liz, Jenny, Sheila, Janelle, Marianne, Jenny, Jess, Diana, Marley, Bronwyn, Jen H, Nadia, and Deb Christian. Did I get everyone?
Eileen, can you hear me?
I hear somebody, but I don't know who that is.
It's Deb Marley.
Oh, yes, thanks.
Renee and Heather are with me.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
Did you say Liz Foley?
I did. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so then let's just start with Eileen. Eileen, what's your word?
Community.
Community. Great. Brittany and Kaylee, how about you guys?
Feminine.
Okay.
Hopeful.
Okay. I'm just reading whatever it says on your little screen. Laura S.
Can't hear you.
Oh, she's on. Let me unmute you. There you go.
Hopeful.
Hopeful. Lynn.
Hope.
Hope. Is it Bronwyn or Branwyn? I'm sorry.
Bronwyn.
Bronwyn. Okay. I just want to make sure I got it right because I mix it up sometimes. Bronwyn.
Cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
Sheila, I see you.
I see you. Get your ass back here. We miss you. Nadia's coming.
Deborah.
Optimistically positive.
Great. Deb Marley.
She stepped out for a quick second.
Okay. Nadia.
Productive.
Productive. Sheila, and someone who's in this beautiful light and has this gorgeous aura that makes me want to make a wish.
You will always get all the attention. Always get all the attention.
Like seriously, everybody look at her. She's like female Jesus with all these rays.
Female Jesus. Jen, it's Jen Hodge.
Hi, Jen.
Hi. Just growth and expansion and light.
Great. Sheila?
So in love with every single one of these women. Just in love, passionately. The hearts, the passion I hear, that's it. Passion, love.
Excellent. And then I know as soon as you say your name, I'm going to feel like an idiot. It says S Factor on your...
Jessica Hopper, maybe?
I was going to say Jessica, and I was like, no, you idiot. Don't say Jessica. That's not her name. Jessica.
Oh, hi. Oh, because I'm probably logged in as teacher training. Sorry.
You are.
Bronwyn took my words, but cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Marianne? Oh, hold on.
I hear you.
Try again. Okay.
I would say I'm feeling contemplative.
Contemplative. Okay, thanks. Oh, Allie. Allie or Alicia?
Alicia.
I would say interested and love.
Got it. Thank you. Jenny. Okay, we'll come back around. How about reception LA?
Hopeful and introspective.
Hopeful and introspective. Okay. All right. Did you guys learn something today? Everybody learn something or have a little more awareness? Yeah. So here's my suggestion. I'm going to make sure that, like I said, I'm going to do the intro for people who are watching the recording. We'll make sure we get a copy of this out to all of you. As I mentioned at the beginning, the one thing I ask is that you do keep this confidential. We talked about some really, specific things, not just in the interest of the organization, but for your peers and your colleagues to have respect for confidentiality in one another. So if we could honor that, I would be especially and personally grateful. Thank you again for your time. If you guys have more questions or if things come up, direct them to Eileen and Sheila. If we need to do any follow-up, I will work that out with them and we'll make sure that you guys get what you need, okay?
And I just want to say love and hugs from Atlanta. Give yourself a big hug. It was nice meeting all of you.
And Jenny, I'm sorry, I didn't want to exclude you. I just realized you don't have a mic on your computer, but if you want to type your word into the chat room before you go, we would love to read it. But understand if people have to go. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Gina, what about Heather and Renee?
Oh, wait, where are Heather and Renee?
They're with
We're here. Thanks.
Oh, wait, where are you?
Very optimistic, Jenny says.
I don't think you can see us. They're with me. They're with Deb Marley.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't see you, so thank you for saying something. Okay, what are your words?
Successful and hopeful.
Successful. Well, those were worth waiting for, huh?
I feel like.
And Jenny said very optimistic. I saw that on her.
I saw that. I was just waiting until we were done here. Okay.
I feel like guided.
Guided.
Excited.
Oh, excited.
Like excited.
Good. Good. Well, I think we've started something that's worth exploring and continuing. So I encourage you to be aware, use the media and use what you're doing outside of work to also educate yourself. See how it shows up in other areas. Use that as practice to see how you would respond in a different situation and see how that shows up. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.
Bye.
And,
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.